I'm Christopher Myers, ran the Kegley Institute of Ethics at CSUB for 30 plus years, one of the early ones to get going. Now retired happily. Those of you who run ethics centers or are involved in them or are starting to run them, I'm sure like the rest of us, you've encountered an array of ethical issues involved in the process of managing a center, everything from conflicts of interest to financial management, staff relations, community relations. And it recently struck a group of us that we're awfully good at talking about the ethics of other organizations, but we've done almost nothing, at least not in writing, on the ethics of ethics centers. The annual summit held yesterday, I assume, it's been pieces of this have been a perennial topic there, but almost nothing in writing. There was one APPE produced monograph back in 2005, I believe, on ethics centers and conflict of interest. Lisa Parker, one of our panelists today, contributed a piece to that, as did Michael Davis. I had a piece in there as well. Otherwise, at least my search and some other searches, we came up with nothing. And it's not like there aren't just a wide array of vexing ethical problems. So we decided it was past time to try to put something together. A group of us started chatting about best ways to do that. And with help from a number of folks, some of whom I'll thank in just a moment, we were able to work it out to do a special issue of Teaching Ethics dedicated to this topic. We did, some of you probably saw, we did a call for papers through APPE and SEAC, and received quite a few submissions of abstracts, out of which we selected about a dozen papers. Not all of those came to fruition, but we've ended up with 11. And as I was mentioning a minute ago, I just received notice from the standing, one of the standing journal editors, Stephen Satras at Clemson, that all of those papers have been accepted by them. And they're just in the process of doing some proofreading, and then they'll send it along to the Philosophy Documentation Center for compilation into first online, and then the print version. Unclear when all of those will be coming, but hopefully soon. Some of the folks who played a key role in this process, Elaine Engelhardt, Michael Pritchard, who's joined us today, Kristen Fuse-Wells, who I see just joined us as well, Patty Stouffer, the former APPE director, and Dan Wieste. They pulled off a first, I think almost a miraculous first. APPE and SEAC, Society for Ethics Across the Curriculum, have had a somewhat tangled relationship over the years, and the folks were able to use this project as a way of reconnecting. And SEAC, who manages the publication of the journal, they agreed to allow APPE members to have access. That was key to using the journal, because we assumed APPE members would be the likeliest audience. And they did their negotiating miracles. And so it is now the case that all APPE members will have access to teaching ethics moving forward. And I believe, even looking back, I think that there was no way for PDC to carve out just this issue either forward or back. Kristen, if I get any of this wrong, let me know. I think they've added a very, very small add-on to the APPE fees, and even that may not have ever come to fruition. So awesome thing. We all APPE members now will have access to teaching ethics. And again, this issue, Kristen just noted, same structure, just an added bonus. That's great, even better. So folks will have access to this and future issues. If you haven't read Teaching Ethics in the past, there's all kinds of great stuff in there about not just pedagogy, but thinking about some of the broader, more philosophical and structural issues involved in our work. So a terrific bonus, and really grateful to them. I'm also grateful to Stephen Satchis, who I mentioned, as well as Aditya Kuzi and the other standing editor, and George Lehman, who's the PDC's director. He's just been an amazing help in getting us through this. So let me introduce our panelists now in the order they'll be speaking. That's Michael Pritchard and Sandy Borden will go first. And again, I'll ask each of you to take just a minute to explain where you are now and a little bit how you came into the project. And then Jonathan Bieber, Lisa Parkers, Michael Burrows, and Michael DeWild. Yes, we have 3 Michaels on the group. That has gotten confusing at times, but hopefully we'll keep it straight today. Each of them will take just a few minutes. We're looking at like 6, 7, 8 minutes each, so that we have plenty of time for conversation at the end. We're hoping to save about 30 minutes for conversation at the end. So with that, Michael and Sandy, I'll hand over the mic.
Thank you, Christopher, for organizing the panel and shepherding this issue of teaching ethics. Mike and I got involved, I think, just because we were aware of the call, and I thought we had something interesting to say about generalist orientation for the Ethics Center. So I'm at Western Michigan University. I'm the current director of the Center for the Study of Ethics and Society there, and Mike is a founding director. And what I thought I would do with my few minutes is give an overview of our article in this special issue. So again, our article explains our generalist orientation to studying a broad range of ethical issues. And by this, we mean an interdisciplinary orientation and again, a kind of a broad focus. So I'm just going to break that down into several dimensions. And we illustrated these dimensions with extended examples in the article. So first, our approach involves valuing an across-the-curriculum approach to promote an understanding of complex ethical issues and to highlight what we consider to be the pervasive role of ethics in society. In line with this, WMU's Ethics Center has always had a board that's represented disciplines across the university. We realized that if we wanted the study of ethics to be for everybody, furthermore, it could not be the exclusive possession of a single discipline like philosophy. From the start, again, we've embodied this approach, and we use pedestrian crossings at roundabouts as an example of a problem that requires insight from multiple disciplines. Second, our approach consists of adopting a broad rather than a narrow focus when it comes to ethics. So unlike ethics centers that focus on one specialty, for example, like bioethics, or maybe in a subset of ethical concerns such as professional ethics, Western's Ethics Center has always had a broad focus. In the article, we describe the center's work with external organizations, including APPE, that are also committed to the full range of ethical issues that matter to society, not just professions or the academy. Third, our approach involves a commitment to practical ethics, which bridges theory and practice to shed light on issues of practical relevance to all. We're concerned with practical issues in society, not esoteric puzzles of interest only to specialists. In the article, we describe the center's involvement with the Ethics Bowl competition to illustrate the kinds of moral problems embodied in Ethics Bowl cases are precisely those that resist the easy application of principles, movement back and forth between theoretical concerns and the details of the case, between the general and the specific mark our approach to practical ethics. Fourth, decentering philosophy as the arbiter of what counts as doing ethics, trying to stand outside any single discipline, even philosophy, is an important way to signal that ethics is everybody's business and that everyone is capable of thinking critically about moral questions. Ethics is always a key draw for the center, but in a way that attends broadly to practical issues in society and involves anyone at the university and the community interested in pursuing those issues. We discuss an example of when public participation served as a corrective for a polemical talk and increased the center's accountability, as well as recent trends toward more engagement with the community. So despite these opportunities, we do acknowledge in the article that the generalist approach comes with some costs. So the article ends with a look at challenges concerning stable funding and administrative support for a center that does not fit neatly into a single academic unit or specialty. And we also share some lessons learned, namely build relationships, especially considering our center's resource challenges. This has proved invaluable as a way to recruit and fund speakers and to amplify our programming and create a sense of ownership among our constituents. Another lesson is to welcome almost anybody to participate. We're willing to entertain virtually any idea that promises to help people reflect well about practical issues in society, whether it's an unusual topic, like what I learned about ethics from Star Wars, or an unusual approach, like staging an original one-act play about sexual harassment in academia. As the old teaching saw goes, meet them where they are. And finally, remove barriers. This is partially a matter of reciprocity. The center does not have a lot of money to throw around, so we're heavily reliant on speakers who charge little or nothing to stretch our resources, but it's also a way of building community. The center intentionally stays away from a pay-to-play approach when courting co-sponsors for its programs, except in exceptional cases when the speaker fees might be fairly high. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike, who can talk about one or two of the examples that we use in the article.
Thank you, Sandy. You've represented the center extremely well this morning. And what I need to say is that although Sandy was not there at the beginning of our center in 1985, when she arrived at Western, she immediately became active in the center, became member of the executive board. And when I retired in 2016, Sandy was more than ready to take over from this dawdling member of the founding group. The center began as a result of several faculty discovering one another willy-nilly, that we had shared interests in some ethical issues. So back in the mid 80s, we had the Pinto case was a very prominent case in the news, and Jim Jacksa from Communication and I had been talking a lot and beginning to write about the Pinto case, and we discovered that our friend Ron Kramer had file drawers filled with information about this case, and that he had gone to the trial of Ford for the company was being accused of taking lives and being criminally culpable. So it was quite a precedent of a case. And then Roger Wallace from management had been paying a lot of attention to this. And then there were faculty from engineering that we discovered who were interested in this. But we had no vehicle for getting together other than kind of stumbling across one another here and there on the campus. And in the summer of 1985, a few of us decided that it would be maybe a good thing if we called together interested faculty to meet in the summer to talk about their interests in ethics and our mutual kind of line crossings. None of us were used to teaching with anyone other than ourselves or members of our own department. So this is what I would call a kind of a siloed approach to ethics. And the result of this meeting in the summer was that we decided to form a center so that we would become more visible across the campus and in the community. And we would use the center as a place where people could come together and talk about issues. So this was a kind of a crude beginning, but very meaningful. And we had a number of faculty who volunteered to serve on the executive board that was being established. So we had a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, and no money. This was our first problem. And as far as ethical issues go, I think we were fairly naive at the beginning, but we got a very small grant. And it turned out that it was a flop. It could have been renewed had there been any particular interest in doing this, but no one really wanted to carry forward a second year because the first year was so unproductive. And it was unproductive because we lacked that enthusiasm for the project. So the first lesson, which I think is an ethics lesson, was that if you're going to go for money or accept money, you better make sure that you have people who are committed to the project. It was a kind of a surprise to us that we had so little enthusiasm for the project, but a lot of enthusiasm for the small amount of money that came with this. We did not initially have anything but a kind of a verbal support from people in the administration, and they had no money at that time. So we were on our own, and eventually we got the support of the dean of the graduate college, who said she had a little bit of money for us so that we could get through the first year and get a little start on the second year. But again, there was a lot of uncertainty, and this financial concern has been with us for how many years, Sandy? Anyway, when there is money that enables us to run a program, sometimes the program that is presented to the public and to the university is not what we had planned. So we had, excuse me, we had a speaker, excuse me. It's early here. It's early here in Utah, which is where I am. One more attempt. So the speaker was going to talk about research on animals. And he was a well-known speaker away from Kalamazoo, where we were, highly regarded and very aggressive. And he was aggressive in a way that was intolerant of significant members of our audience. Those who were concerned about doing research on animals, particularly research that ends up with the animals at the end of the research being terminated. But this speaker was very intolerant, very abusive verbally, and he also came with the support of the pharmaceutical company that was very prominent in Kalamazoo at the time, the Upjohn Company. So now people look at this and they say, what is this center up to? It brings in somebody who lambastes the people who are opposed to research on animals and doesn't give them a voice. And we thought, well, we made a mistake. And we had to figure out what to do about this. Well, our solution was to set up another panel, and this represented other perspectives that were not tolerated by our first speaker. It would have been better had we not had this talk in the first place. But how do we guard against having very unpopular speakers who betray for us the purpose of our center? So that's one kind of ethical problem, and it's hard to always anticipate, and we haven't always succeeded, but we've always tried to follow up with some kind of remedy and hope for the best. My time is nearly up. I think that I just want to close for now with a comment about the generalist approach that we tend to take with ethics. We think of ethics as being potentially everywhere, not just in the classroom, not just in the philosophy department. And we want people to be welcome. It takes work, whatever area you come from. But the question is, will that work be accepted as valuable? And we say yes. And if we had time, we could go into the conception of practical ethics that seems to be what we're trying to put forward. And I think we've done rather well, and I've been pleased to be part of this center, and extremely pleased with the work that Sandy has been doing to carry on in my leisurely absence. So with that, I will stop for now.
Thanks, Michael and Sandy. Just a reminder, we're going to save questions and comments for the end. Again, we're hoping to have about 30 minutes worth. Please don't just ask questions of the last speaker. If you have something for Michael and Sandy, jot down a note and we'll hope to get to everyone. Next up is Jonathan Bieber.
Thanks, Christopher, and thanks everybody for being here. So yeah, I'm Jonathan Bieber. I'm an associate professor of ethics and digital culture. My title's weird because I'm split between the philosophy department and a text and technology PhD program here at the University of Central Florida. I'm also the founding director of our Center for Ethics, which reports to our VP for Research. So it's situated for broad reach across the university. My university is interesting in that it's incredibly large. It's over 70,000 students. We're a relatively young R1 research institution located in Florida, so a state riddled with ethical issues of multiple kinds at this point. And the purpose of the center is to focus on institutional transformation research and student and colleague support. It's been a really fun sort of sandbox for me to do much of the work that I think Sandra and Michael were talking about in terms of the generalist approach. So we're not directed to any particular kind of ethics research, but I do ethics research as an individual scholar and then support my colleagues in thinking about ethics. So I'm grateful to have contributed to the special edition of Teaching Ethics, and I'll talk a little bit about that work in just 5 or 6 minutes. I was interested, and I was grateful for Christopher and the editorial team for allowing me to do this work, to think about the role that I defined it as conceptual stewardship, the role that ethics centers play in helping our institutions better understand and more clearly define the concepts, the normative concepts at work. Ethics centers are positioned uniquely at institutions like mine to sort of do that conceptual work, to think what do we do with normatively thick concepts that are an amalgam of fact and value? How do we make appropriate and clear use of those difficult and thick concepts? I think that's an issue for institutions and therefore work for ethics centers because of sort of two paired problems: the unintentional and the intentional misuse of those concepts. So on the unintentional side, misuse of thick concepts can basically is a problem of clarity. It leads to people talking past one another. If I'm using a concept in this way and my colleagues in, say, STEM fields are using it in this way, we're just missing each other when we talk, right? That's an unintentional misuse. There's another flip side to that problem though, and that's the intentional misuse. You're gonna hear my clock go off, I apologize. It's just one of those things about the Zoom environment. The other side of that coin is the intentional misuse. So this is manipulative use of normative concepts to sort of signal virtue. This has been called out, especially in the business ethics literatures, as a problem of virtue signaling, the idea that I can use normative concepts. I won't put it on me. My institution can use normative concepts to basically signal to external stakeholders that we've got goodness going on at the institution. We're an ethical institution without actually anything to back that up. So these paired problems of unintentional and intentional misuse are the reason I think conceptual stewardship is so important. I built this case in the essay by thinking about one concept specifically, and that was the concept of integrity. The concept at my institution and many of our institutions is widely used, but it's also underdefined. I'll give you just one example. The mission of the ethics wing of our compliance, ethics, and risk office at my institution, the folks who handle compliance and regulatory things, they define the ethics component as the job of the ethics component is to foster a culture of integrity, trust, and respect. And beyond clustering with normative concepts like trust and respect, they don't do any further work to define integrity. And so it's left kind of this murky signal of what they're up to, but not very clearly defined. In my role at the university in both philosophy and the Center for Ethics, I do a lot of workshops for students and faculty trying to differentiate research, academic, and personal integrity as one way to get at some nuance in that concept. And I've come around to the idea that integrity has at least two parts, right? There's a moral component and a structural component, or what I called in the project righteousness and coherence. These two parts have to work together towards the right ends. So there's that structural bit, like the working together of the parts, and the towards the right end part, which is the normative part. And the account I built was that this thickness of concepts like integrity really make concepts like integrity virtue concepps. In a traditional virtue model, the individual and the institution, or the individual and external constraints, have to synergize to enable virtuous character development. And the struggle to cultivate virtue against external pressures is just easier if the external pressures are lower. And this is one thing that I think is missing from the debate. It's not really a debate. The lack of debate around integrity at my institution is that we miss the idea that integrity is a problem of justice, right? Holding it together requires understanding and unpacking those structural inequities and inequalities that make it harder for some people to uphold integrity and easier for others to do so. I didn't talk this through very carefully in the paper, but I wanted to say now, as I've been thinking about this more, one pushback somebody might say is that it might seem on my account that my account means that underprivileged persons are less virtuous. And that's not the approach. I don't think that's the consequence I want to draw, of course, but I think what I'm after is that those of us who face different levels of external stressors require more energy to sustain and overcome those stressors. So it might actually be the case that it is harder, but more meaningful to cultivate virtue against pressure. But again, the integrity, well, I think the integrity concept and the analysis that I've been doing is really interesting. Generally speaking, the problem of these normative concepts is this problem of clarity, this problem of misuse. Without that work that I've been going through with integrity, without somebody doing that work at our institutions, we're more used to misusing our concepts, again, either unintentionally or intentionally. So what can ethics centers do? I laid out a few suggestions that from my own thinking and my colleagues' thinking, including many of you in this room. But one thing we can do is identify exemplars, whether those are in individual lives, whether those are in film or fiction or in our institutional communities. My graduate students in my integrity workshops have turned to Reddit for the so-called Trinity of Wholesomeness recently, talking about Bob Ross, Fred Rogers, and Steve Irwin as markers of integrity in our communities. We can also make visible the conceptual work that we do. Part of this is selfish, right? As a philosopher who does this kind of work, I want my role to be highlighted in my university, but I also think lots of people across lots of disciplines at our institutions do this work. And to make it more visible, I think is to the institution's benefit. And then to the extent that our centers can, we can and should work against those structural barriers those structural components of integrity, to use the power and position of our institutions, our centers, to help overcome those barriers and therefore to support integrity at the individual level. And this all sort of culminates in the idea that what we're doing when we're building ethics cultures is cultivating ethically engaged communities, right? Sort of building what Nancy Tawana called ethics literacy, the idea that we're building up communities who are directly engaged in cultivating ethics on the ground. I'm going to pause there for the sake of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Just really cool, fascinating stuff. Next up is Lisa Parker, who's, as I noted earlier, contributed to the earlier APPE monograph on conflict of interest. For many of us, it's sort of the core issue surrounding this whole exploration into the ethics of ethics centers. And if you read her full essay, she won't be able to do it justice today. You'll see she gets at it really well. So you're all facing these problems. I hope you find some of the contributions in the journal helpful in working your way through those. Lisa.
So thank you very much. I do think that conflict of interest touches on many of the topics we're already discussing today, particularly once we recognize that many of our conflicts of interest are not financial, but certainly insofar as finances are tight for most ethics centers, financial conflicts of interest are of course, they arise. So what I want to do is briefly define how I use that term and I guess distinguish an individual and institutional conflict of interest. And then, as I do in the paper, recommend a reasonable person standard for determining when the conflicts exist and describe how they arise for ethics centers. And I direct the Center for Bioethics and Health Law at the University of Pittsburgh. I've directed it for, I guess, the past 6 years and have been in Pittsburgh now most of my adult life since I earned my graduate degree in philosophy there and went away and then was hired back into the center. Like many of our centers, mine lives in many units and in many different worlds and ethical cultures and other academic cultures. So it does make for challenges in especially convincing my colleagues that conflicts of interest arise apart from money. So I would like then to go on and talk about two primary problems with disclosure as a remedy for conflicts of interest, either individual or institutional, and maybe suggest what might help to redress the problem, though it feels a bit like what my engineering colleagues now call sort of a soft skills solution, as opposed to something that's easily implemented and cut and dried. So I argue that a conflict of interest exists when a party with a fiduciary duty to exercise judgment in the service of a primary interest has a secondary interest that threatens to bias that judgment. So I don't argue that, actually. I rely on a number of people before me who have argued it quite adequately and eloquently. But an example in a dyadic context would be when a financial advisor earns a larger commission when selling one commodity rather than another, and then recommends that higher commission bearing commodity. Or actually, when he makes any recommendation, given that it's in light of or in the context of having that conflicting interest, which could be said to bias his judgment. When a doctor profits from use of an MRI machine and recommends or is in a position to recommend it or not to diagnose the cause of a headache. So the secondary interest need not be financial, but often is. It's not, in my opinion, necessary that the secondary interest actually bias the judgment nor is it necessary that harm actually results. It's sufficient that the risk of bias arise due to the secondary interest. And it's the risk of the bias that appropriately undermines trust in the fiduciary's judgment. So what I'm embracing here, and this is a bit my own, along with a colleague, Valerie Sapkowski, is a reasonable person standard for determining when a conflict of interest exists. It exists when a reasonable person may reasonably believe that the exercise of judgment is biased by a secondary interest. This notion is borrowed from tort law, where the concept of the reasonable person is used to establish a duty of care. It relies on a socially constructed, publicly accessible, publicly debatable view of what is reasonable for an admittedly fictitious, normatively defined reasonable person to believe. And I like to employ this understanding because I think it makes sense of the fact that conflict of interest may undermine public trust in science and in other fields, that it threatens fiduciary relationships, that clients and publics should regard with increased skepticism, judgment, or advice offered by those who have conflicts of interest, whether or not harm results. It's the risk of bias. So ethics centers themselves, and through the intellectual work of their faculty or staff, their members, have a fiduciary duty to engage in at least some activities such as these: investigating ethical issues or concerns, providing sound ethical judgments, arguments, presenting programming or teaching about ethical issues, providing consultation on ethical issues. And they do so in the service of the public interest or the social good. The primary interest of an ethics center and their faculty and staff is to serve the public's interest or social good through the exercise of judgment in these activities about ethical concerns. And like the academic institutions or other entities that often house them, ethics centers themselves act as institutional entities or as corporate persons. They may enter into contracts, they may receive gifts, donations, grants, they sponsor programs, they engage in these activities sometimes as a center. They act as an entity distinct from their individual faculty or staff members. So an ethics center's institutional conflict of interest arises when its interests or the interests of a person who has authority to act on its behalf threaten the ability of the center or its members, jointly or severally, to serve its primary interest. So an ethics center that's supported by, let's say, the Trans-America Football Group may reasonably be thought to have a financial institutional conflict of interest when its members comment on the ethical and social implications of professional sports betting, or provide ethics education to sports medicine fellows about concussion, for example. If the center director enters into a consulting contract, say with Drone Warfare Incorporated, to have her center's colleagues advise on the development of uninhabited aircraft, she creates an institutional conflict of interest for the center and individual conflicts of interest for her colleagues. So it's often argued that disclosure of conflicts of interest should be used to remedy, or at least provide a partial remedy for them. But I think that disclosure is an inadequate remedy for conflict of interest for several reasons, and in fact may even exacerbate the problems that conflicts of interest present. It may increase inappropriate or misplaced trust. It may exacerbate a lack of trustworthiness on the part of the advisor, the ethicist, the person who has the duty to provide sound judgment in the service of the interests of others. So in the paper, in the volume, I go through 6 distinguishable problems. I'd like to talk briefly about two of them. The first is that disclosure has perverse psychological effects. So studies have shown that in dyadic contexts, like a physician-patient, financial advisor-client, disclosure may actually increase the disclosure recipient's trust because the disclosing professional appears more honest, trustworthy, and credible. And it would seem to me that there's no reason that this shouldn't occur when an institution, when an ethics center discloses its conflicting interests. It also, this disclosure can provide sort of a moral license to the advisor to exaggerate the bias of the offered judgment, sort of to counterbalance the anticipated discounting that the advisor thinks the disclosure recipient will then do. If I really, really believe that my patient needs to have that MRI, but I have to disclose that I own the machine and will profit from its use, I may push a little harder for the reasons that that MRI is really in that patient's interest, because I know that my judgment, I know in quotes, that my judgment may be discounted by my patient. And even when the disclosure recipient is in fact made more skeptical of the fiduciary's judgment, some studies show that the recipient is actually less likely to reject the judgment or the recommendation in order to preserve a professional-client relationship. Now, that probably doesn't arise as a problem for some relationships, or perhaps for centers and publics that they serve. But in dyadic contexts, where the relationship itself is very important, that may occur. And then finally, in this regard, there's just the question of what a client or a patient or a public being served is supposed to do with a disclosure. It's like they came to us for a reason. They wanted an opinion. And now we say, well, here's the opinion, here's the argument, but we have to disclose that we do have these conflicting interests. So what? Go somewhere else for another opinion? And indeed, getting second opinions can help to dispel the effect of conflicting interests. But that's not because of the disclosure. It's because of the seeking of multiple points of advice, or multiple arguments, and then assessing what is the best one. The second problem is that disclosure can't address silencing due to conflict of interest. Disclosures of conflicts of interest can only be attached to the rendering of a judgment, the publishing of research, the giving a talk, the teaching a topic, offering consultative service. If a conflict of interest, or individual or institutional, prevents taking up a topic, prevents pursuing a question or analyzing a problem or offering a criticism, there's no occasion to disclose that fact. Not addressing an ethical concern that comes to their attention, or turning a blind eye to something so that we avoid learning of a concern, may indeed be contrary to an ethicist's or an ethics center's primary interest of serving the public interest. So disclosure doesn't do anything for that. And this, in fact, is the issue that I thought was most thorny and remained problematic at the end of that 2005 APPE symposium of ethics centers and conflicts of interest. Because someone there put forward that, well, but think about an ethics center director who refuses to take a call from a news reporter in the midst of breaking news about the business dealings of a major donor to the center. And the person who presented this very brief outline of a case said, and by not commenting, the center avoids the conflict of interest. But I would argue it doesn't. It's reasonable to believe that his judgment regarding whether or not to comment is biased by his conflicting secondary interest in protecting his center's financial interests by protecting its donors' reputational interests. Another case of quasi-silencing, I'll say, or at least silent influence, is consider an ethics bowl or paper prize judge who must recuse herself from judging her own students' performance or submission. Nevertheless, she may be subliminally influenced by her students' participation or her colleagues' participation and judge other submissions more harshly. She would need to, in fact, opt out entirely. So how can the subliminal influence be avoided so that trust in the judge's judgment may be reasonably justified? That's the question. And I think the answer is to have completely disconnected out of the running judges. But in general, how could we address, as ethicists and ethics centers, the problems of conflicts of interest, individual and institutional? One remedy may be to avoid obvious conflicts of interest, their sources. So avoid gifts, avoid donations, avoid funding from industry or others that have obvious strings attached, that have non-disclosure agreements or pre-review of your opinions, this sort of thing. Also negotiate clear agreements ensuring the right to publish, the right to speak out, informing donors that, look, we're going to keep commenting on X even though you're in that field. We're going to talk about climate change even though you're a petroleum company supporting our center. But also, I think, and more generally, that conflicts of interest can in part be addressed by being ethicists, by what we do. When we do ethics, we show our work. By showing our work, we also then educate our audience, our publics, and help them to develop the skills to evaluate ethical judgment, ethical arguments, and be more likely to discern sources of bias and those effects. So I think that by fulfilling our educational role, we may best serve, or that fulfilling that educational role may best serve as a check on the risk of secondary interests biasing the work of ethicists and ethics centers. I think it's in teaching, in making arguments, in showing our work, in making all of the points that feed into a recommendation, a conclusion of an argument, that we enable others to develop the skills, to evaluate our skills, to evaluate our normative commitments, and to evaluate our conflicting interests and biases. So that is the argument that I present in the paper and that I share today and hope we can discuss. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Great stuff. As she noted, opening, there's themes and connections throughout. You may recall that Michael noted that their center does not do so-called pay for play. They do not want to be overly influenced by a corporate entity or whomever in sponsoring a speaker. As Lisa's pointing out, that may just shift the problem to a secondary source, including our own campus administrators. So huge, difficult problems throughout all of these. Our last two speakers are both addressing more or less a similar topic. I'm sure many of you personally and institutionally have struggled over the last couple of years, maybe over the last 6 years, on the role of advocacy or activism in our ethics work. For many folks, this came to a head after the George Floyd murder, and trying to figure out the extent to which ethics centers should be advocates for particular ethics positions is deeply challenging. Michael Burrows, now the director at the Kegley Institute, and Michael DeWild at Grand Valley State in Michigan are each addressing these. I'm going to let Michael Burrows go first, and then after Michael DeWild, we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Christopher, and thanks so much for organizing this collection and this panel, and to all my panelists, great to see you too, if just virtually for now. And thanks so much for sharing your research and your ideas today. Yeah, so my paper and for this collection and my talk today is titled On Ethics Institute Activism. And there's a couple of overarching questions. I'm still thinking about this topic. Fortunately, this paper allowed me to flesh out my ideas a bit more concretely, but I see this as a continuing project. But there's kind of two overarching questions that I want to use to frame today. One is, what role should activism, if any role, play within our institute's initiatives? And then secondly, what is activism, right? The philosophical question there, because I think that's not just one thing or one set of activities. The reason that this question has become important for me, and maybe some of you can relate to this too, in directing an ethics center. So I've been fortunate enough to be director of the Kegley Institute since 2017, and taking over from the great work that Christopher did in founding and establishing the center and developing it over many years. When you're a community-based ethics center, and by that I mean an ethics center that's not solely university focused in its programming, but you have community members engaging with you quite regularly, coming to your events. Your events are actually geared towards pressing issues in your community and region, for example. The Kegley Institute very much fits that mold. You are inevitably faced with challenges or opportunities, right, to take explicitly activist stances on pressing issues in your community. And you need to, personally, you may have specific political leanings or ideas about what positions you should take, but you also need to recognize the downstream impacts of taking certain positions, right? So just for example, I mean, we, several years back, we brought in Dr. Angela Davis to speak on incarceration in the prison industrial complex. That, of course, is relevant because in the Central Valley of California, there's a massive incarceration footprint. We have like 12 or 13 prisons just right in our region. So there's a large incarcerated population. It has a huge economic and social impact on our region. Dr. Angela Davis, obviously, probably one of the most famous activists alive today. And at the same time, a tremendous scholar who can shed important insight and educational opportunities on this issue for us. But in bringing in a speaker like that, you are signaling, perhaps intentionally or not, to community about your political leanings as well. Another example was free speech conflicts. There's a neighboring university in our city. There's a pretty nasty free speech conflict going on between some professors at the Center for Social Justice and some professors who are challenging kind of the free speech rights and how they're adopted at this university. And we were contacted about, will we help kind of take a position in support of the Center for Social Justice, right? And in this free speech conflict. That's another decision where you're saying, okay, well, I might have sympathies with what these professors are going through, but if we take this position, right, what audiences do we alienate, and how do we look on a broader, spectrum? So, another reason this becomes relevant, though, is that, and I think as Christopher has noted in a recent paper on activism too, ethics isn't a neutral enterprise, right? We're committed to better as opposed to worse outcomes. We're committed to seeking the good in our communities in some way, as opposed to just merely theoretically analyzing what is good. And so I think when you're committed to creating the good as much as possible, that can also align you in some ways with some forms of activism and action in our communities. Finally, though, Christopher mentioned, the murder of George Floyd in May 2020, and I think I don't know how you all experience that in the context of your centers, but for me, it was a distinct social movement, right? And one where we have a long history of doing programming actually on racism, oppression, social justice. That's not new for us as a center, but I think that was a historical moment where we were really all called to evaluate what we're doing, why we're doing it, how is our programming being responsive to problems of racism and also promoting anti-racism in some ways. And that came to a head for me in that I was contacted I'm gonna actually put in the chat right now a link to something I'll reference in a moment. I was contacted by the Bakersfield Police Department chief and members of and the city manager to take the lead on forming a what ended up being referred to as the Bakersfield Police Department Community Collaborative, which was really a citywide police reform initiative. The goal was to form community-based committees in several key areas to do research on what BPD was currently doing in terms of evaluating areas of potential reform within its policies and practices, look at national recommendations and recommendations from other cities and police departments, and eventually form a robust police reform recommendations report that we presented to the chief, the city council, and the city manager. That work took about, we had a 6-month mandate initially. We expanded that to 8 months. And the report that I put in the link is actually kind of like the fruit of those labors that we did present to the city council and the city manager in March 2021. I can talk more about that work. I don't have a great deal of time today, but I can say that when I was asked to take over that role, I was thinking about, well, personally, right, and what we know about our nation's history, and what we know about policing in America, and we know about, public safety in our communities. Police reform is an important issue in the context of Bakersfield. The history of policing is fraught. There have been, including there's a 2015 infamous Guardian article on Kern County policing having per capita the highest rates of killing of civilians of any police department in the country. So there's real attention needs to be paid to policing ethics issues in our community. But I also thought, okay, as an institute, if we take on this initiative, right, this seems directly activist in orientation, and people's opinions in Kern County are quite mixed about the need for police reform. And so I think again these questions of my personal sympathies and what I think needs to be done in our community versus, okay, what does this mean for the direction of our institute and our future programming and audiences that will hear us or kind of close us off and not engage us with any further. Obviously, we ultimately decided as an institute in consultation with my board that we should take on this initiative. And I think I'm very glad we did for several reasons that I'm happy to talk about more in the discussion too, about kind of the virtues that came out of that work. In addition to just the ethical import, I think, of engaging in that process and being a leader in our community in that way at a time when that was very much in need. I want to note though, one potential conceptual confusion that I think comes out of these discussions around, should we be activists? How activist should we be? What does activism look like in our initiatives? Is that, activism is not just one uniform set of practices. And I think sometimes we have kind of a default conception of what that is. And I think that default conception is often, I think, directly political activism, right? Where it's this idea of using direct action for the purposes of achieving a specific political end. So that might be something like running for office, mobilizing a political campaign, forming an organization with a specific political objective in mind, contacting public officials, actions like that, right? And there's interesting discussion, in the literature on ethics and activism. I just want to, give credit where credit's due. There's a 2019 paper by Ben Jones, who works at the Rock Ethics Institute and is a close friend and colleague of mine, called Political Activism and Research Ethics, and also a 2020 paper by Jelena Oxley called How to Be a Good Philosopher Activist. I think both really grapple with this notion of political activism very well. And as this is a sidebar issue, they also deal with this tricky issue of, okay, does engaging with activism bias us in ways that actually could negatively impact our programming? And I think they contend with an objection from the philosopher Bas van der Bossen, who actually argues that philosophers and ethicists should avoid activism precisely because it ends up biasing our positions in our work in a way that runs against academic virtues of transparency, neutrality, kind of seeking the truth and the truth only, as opposed to seeking the truth to support a specific political position that we hold, right? And so they deal with that kind of conflict really well, and that was influencing my thinking on this too. So there is a political activist stance we can take, right? And I think oftentimes as ethics institutes, we kind of try to avoid that explicitly political activist position, right? For reasons that I've noted. But at the same time, there's also, I think, this broader sense of activism that gets to a sense of what it means to do ethics. And that is, building relationships and community for the purposes of creating change in one's community, right? And that change could be directly political in nature. It could be small scale. It could be just having community members come together to think about an issue deeply together, to consider forms of action they can take in their own homes or their schools or their place of work. There can be lots of different ways we can think about community change, right? And I think that also is a form of activism that is often overlooked in the literature or kind of downplayed, kind of in relation to like the more prominent, default conception of explicitly political activism. And I think we could talk more in the Q&A about what role political activism, if any, should play, right, in our initiatives and our work. But I think this broader sense of activism that I'm fleshing out, sometimes I refer to it as kind of subtle activism in a way, really does play a fundamental role in much of the work that we do as ethics institutes. And I think, for example, of the ethics panels, community conversations, speakers who are speaking directly to helping illuminate dimensions of pressing issues in our communities we wouldn't have otherwise committed. I think all of this work in the sense of community building and education can be considered a form of broader activism in the sense that I'm developing in the paper. And I do think that work is vitally important and has a really vital role to play at our universities and our communities beyond political activist orientations. One thing I'll note here too is I think when it comes to activist discussions, I think one of the areas of caution that we sometimes keep in mind is, okay, well, if we take activist stances, or even if we even use the terminology of activism, we potentially alienate members of our population who would come to our events, or we potentially alienate donors, right, who might be kind of worried about us taking activist positions. And I think that those concerns are valid ones, and we could talk about specific examples where I've encountered that. I know, Christopher, many of you probably have encountered issues with sponsors being concerned about a position you were taking or not taking in relation to a specific issue or a topic that you were using for your program, or a speaker you're bringing in, whatever it might be. But I think we kind of run even more of a risk by not kind of engaging with our community around difficult issues and being willing to bring in speakers who are maybe going to challenge us in important ways, but maybe unpopular with certain segments of our community. We run more of a risk by not addressing, issues that are actually important in our community, by not being relevant, right? By not actually having avoiding kind of the difficult conversations that sometimes are not the most fun ones to have, or the most challenging ones to have. And so I think that's something that I keep in mind too, is kind of balancing this notion of, okay, how do we be as open as possible to all of our community members and as many views as possible, while at the same time noting that there's a real importance at times for us to take specific movements towards activism and create specific conversations in our campus and our community, even if they're challenging ones to have. So I'm happy to talk more about kind of my thinking there in terms of the virtues and the potential downsides of kind of, thinking about activism in our work. But for the purposes of time, given that I think I'm maybe even a minute or two over, I'll pause there. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Michael. Perfect segue to Michael DeWild, getting at much the same topic. Michael.
Thank you. And thank you to Christopher and to Michael Burrows for making my paper much better than it otherwise would have been. So appreciate your comments, and I look forward to discussing maybe the difference between activism and advocacy too as we get into Q&A. Christopher, I know you wanted to leave about 30 minutes for 4 questions. We're already at the point where we only have about 20. So how about if I just give the faintest whiff of my paper, which will give it an air of mystery, perhaps inspire other people to go and want to read it. I don't know, something like that. So just one quick example of the title of I'm here in Grand Rapids, relatively conservative, but also thriving area. We are at the forefront of a lot of programming that goes on in terms of our ethics center. The title is Rethinking Our Role and Moving from a place where originally I had said, I kind of thought of us as the Switzerland of ethics centers. We would just be a neutral platform and let 1,000 voices bloom, and the good ones would drive out the bad ones, and everybody could make up their own mind. Early example of that, about 9 years ago, I did sponsored a panel on the future of capitalism, a perennial topic. And I had everybody from essentially a Zapatista sympathizer who was, as anti-capitalist as you could imagine, really passionate young man who had worked down there, across the spectrum to somebody who was as dyed-in-the-wool, sort of corporate Friedman-esque free market guy. And it was really well attended, and everybody was popping, and it was arguments followed, and assertions, threats were made, all kinds of wonderful stuff happened. And I walked away thinking, well, that was really, really successful, because people were so, quote, engaged with it. We didn't take any stance ourselves at all. We just gave this platform, sort of the big tech defense, right? Oh, we don't have to, we're not journalistic. We just provide the vehicle. Anyway, fast forward to this last year when we started a webinar series, come off the heels of the pandemic, where people were not getting in person. And I trotted out the future of capitalism again. And this time I did not invite anybody from extreme positions. It seemed to me like after the last 5 years, we'd have enough extreme positions represented. It's easy enough to find extreme positions if you want them. And so instead, and I'll just redo this one paragraph and then talk about the four principles behind this, and then I'll stop so we can get to Q&A. But why not sort of repeat what I thought was a successful treatment of that topic 8 or 9 years ago? Why not invite a classic free market capitalism person to the webinar discussion? The short answer is because I write, any honest, informed person will admit, as even the Business Roundtable has, that A, there's no such thing as truly unfettered free market capitalism, and there never was. And B, the conversation has moved on now to how and what kind of political economy can give us both prosperity and sustainability. So traditional shareholder capitalism has shown it can barely fathom the questions of long-term returns that factor in social and labor concerns, the pricing of externalities and stakeholder interests, since it either can't or won't address those questions responsibly, since those questions relate directly to the existential crises we find ourselves in. I'm not persuaded, as the director of the Ethics Center, Business Ethics Center in my case, to allow it to reiterate views that not only poorly correspond to reality. So my epistemological basis is correspondence theory. By the same token, it no longer seemed especially helpful to give time to arguments for, say, radical communism either. We had Jerry Davis as one of the speakers, the political sociologist from the Ross School, University of Michigan, was one of the guests. He gave a really nice measured defense of Scandinavian-style mixed economies. And it has seemed to me that in a limited way, climate change, political economies, the public health crisis, I've wanted to err on the side now of narrowing the number of voices that I actually have on our platforms rather than expand it. And that's different for me because I'm an old school sort of Anglo-American adherent to pluralism. And I love the idea of everybody at the table, and the good ideas driving out the bad ones. But I think one of the things that I've come to understand is that I should recognize when pluralism has done its job. In other words, there are things we don't really need maybe to discuss as much anymore. I use an easy example, or at least potentially easy example in the paper, and that is, I'm not going to hold a conference on slavery and say, well, maybe there's still some pro-slavery folks out there, and we should invite them to the table and make sure all those views are considered fairly. That would be a waste of everybody's time. We would be pilloried, rightly so. And maybe that'll be true in 50 years of traditional free market shareholder style capitalism. And I want to be the sort of leading that discussion rather than bringing the rear on it. So the 4 principles that I outlined in the paper were, again, this allowing that pluralism perhaps has done its job. The discussion around certain topics is over. I'm not bringing a climate denier onto any kind of platform or debate. You know, I'm not giving time to that. What cognitive and other kinds of evolutionary scientists are calling moral switching, the possibility that, as Michael just referred to, moral progress coming down on the side of what's better in the service of what's good is a real possibility. And we can nudge and push and expose people to arguments and ideas and emotional stories, et cetera, that help bring that about. An example would be gay marriage, for example. You know, depending on your own point of view on that, you know, when I was a kid, it would be unthinkable that gay marriage should be, you know, the law of the land in the United States. Now it is. I would argue, I'd want the center to argue that that's a good thing. It's a good thing for business and society. So that's the second one. The third one, were just a recognition of the existential crises that we're in. And though every era can lay claim to an awful lot of existential crises, the climate change all by itself leads me to want to bring people in to speak, to engage our students, our community, faculty, et cetera, who are on the leading edge of, okay, what do we actually do now? Because this is not something we can just think about or talk about ad infinitum. And then finally, the last one, the principle for moving towards this advocacy position rather than this, you know, being Switzerland, is combating disinformation. And I make a distinction in the paper between misinformation and disinformation. I think disinformation has become more and more the law of the land. And so I also think that, you know, there's still something to be said for the old notion that facts are facts. You know, sometimes truths actually are truths, they're not up for debate. And that the center should be position itself so that we are combating disinformation where that's otherwise prevailed. So I will leave it there.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate you doing the briefer overview. His paper, I think, is one of the best in the collection. So,
can you say more about that, Christian?
For exactly that reason, he brings his personality and humor into the paper while also talking about great stuff. So make sure you give it due credit. And just in case we lose some folks, I also want to note that we are thinking about turning this into a book project, depending on how quietly or loudly the journal issue lands, if there's interest. Springer has expressed an interest, and I'm in conversation with some folks at Wiley. So we may be turning this into a book down the road, and we'll be putting out a call for papers at that point. I have like zero experience managing a conversation on Zoom. So Tyler, if I can, I'm going to turn it back over to you to manage how questions should be handled, and encourage folks to jump in now.
Of course, thank you very much, Christopher, and for everyone on the panel and providing their papers today. Appreciate it. For anyone that is attending on Zoom, feel free to post any questions or comments you may have for our panel today in the chat, or simply unmute or raise a hand and we will get to you.
I'll start if you'd like. My question is for Jonathan. As you alluded to, you're in Florida. Lots of news coming out of Florida, and you know, one way or the other, from an academic integrity, academic freedom point of view. At least what I read in the media, none of it sounds terribly promising. Do you want to comment on that and how that, maybe a little bit more about how that aligns with the notion of integrity and what you're all up against there, if in fact you think you're up against anything?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I guess I'll tread cautiously since we're recorded here, but the political landscape is interesting, right? The state legislature has proposed and now has passed up, sitting on the governor's desk, a series of legislation that would have significant impact on academic freedom. Some of that has to do with what can and can't be said by faculty, what can and can't be recorded by students, what topics K through 12 education can and can't take up. I mean, this just goes on, and it is all deeply politicized, right? It's nothing really to do with what's actually happening at universities. It's what has to do with the perception about what should and shouldn't be in the public discourse. So that is an integrity issue, of course. And it's for all of the conflict of interest concerns that were brought up in the panel today, and also concerns about reasonableness, it puts ethics centers in a really interesting position, because if we wanted to rely on reasonableness criteria for what we should and shouldn't discuss as ethics centers, that's contingent in some ways on reasonableness actually being a thing anymore. And here in Florida, it's tough, right? Our university structure is indebted to the state, not just in terms of funding, but also in terms of agendas and potential for the future. And so everybody from the upper administration here, not just at UCF, but in Florida generally, is treading very carefully. Faculty have a little more liberty there, so it's been really interesting to have those conversations sort of in-house, but they can't leave the house very readily because of barriers at the upper administration level, if that all makes sense. And I feel like I'm treading maybe too carefully for this discussion, but that's, to be more explicit, the faculty have really pointed discussions, and our students do too, but to get that out in our communities is a tougher move.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I see we have a hand raised from Jay Pearl. Jay, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. All of these were great discussions. I had a question that is probably best directed at the two Michaels that closed out the program. So one of the things I'm really interested in is the sort of implicit voices that are not actually present at panels, but are sort of implicitly present at panels. So for example, I hosted a program at the Atkins Center last year that was called Riot Ethics. This program was designed to look at the role of property destruction in protest movements and ask, when is this ethical? When is it not ethical? And we brought in some panelists to speak about this. It was a really nice program. But one of the comments that I got, right, was sort of a both sides comment. Well, you didn't have anyone there saying that it's bad and always bad and it should never happen. And part of my response to that was, that's correct. I didn't have that perspective. But the reason I didn't feel I need to was because that is the perspective, like in the culture, right? There's this implicit voice. Every news report for, the entire
I think.
Jay, we lost your connection if you're there, if you can reconnect.
Sounds like he was teeing up a fascinating question too.
We got right to the buildup and we lost him.
I know.
Well, there is the implicit question, right? Of what about that implicit voice? Is it okay? Is it ethically permissible to assume that the dominant view is already there?
Yeah. So one thing, I guess, kind of one thing that his question makes me think about is, well, so first of all, the framing of both sides. I kind of, and I don't mean this from his perspective specifically, but when that point is raised a bit, I kind of bristle a little bit, because I think it's actually a problem. We think about like polarization around issues. The whole framing of both sides is part of that problem. There's not just two sides, like to any issue. There's like many sides, right? I mean, it's not just two different positions. And I think actually we benefit from framing our programs as not being just pro-con, right? I think that kind of makes it way too binary. That being said, I think more to like the spirit of his comment, I think there really is, I'm trying to think how to frame this. Like, I remember I did we did a program at the Kegley Institute on ICE detention facilities in our community and kind of immigration justice around that issue. And unfortunately, in Bakersfield and Kern County, there are in our immediate surroundings, there's 2 ICE detention facilities. And we brought together a ACLU lawyer, and an immigration rights activist, and one other individual to speak on the panel. And that was when we were thinking, okay, are we going to have like an ICE officer on this panel, and would they even be willing to speak? And we ended up not going that direction, in part for practical difficulties, like finding somebody from an ICE facility who'd be willing to represent kind of the work they're doing and speak in a public forum like that was actually no easy task. But it made me think a lot, like a program like that, I think if we're lacking specific voices on a panel like that, specifically persons who are working directly with persons in a center, in an ICE detention facility, or a person who is from a community that's being proportionally impacted by an ICE detention facility, then I think we're actually doing a injustice to the conversation. And I think he'd be rightly criticized for that. But I don't know, Michael, if you have thoughts about this too. I think for me, it's really contextual about, you know, what voices need to be there and how you prioritize that, given you really can have like 3 people on a panel oftentimes at these events, 3 or 4 at most, if you're actually going to be able to have time for conversation. So it's also a practical issue that can be really tricky about how you bring in voices while also preserving time for conversation. And you can't include every perspective, right, on a panel. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that either in your work.
So the most recent example for us was a vaccine mandate panel about 4 months or so ago, and we framed it as a question. You know, are vaccine mandates ethical? And even framing it as a question, you know, I ended up with a handful of credible death threats. And so we had now the chief medical officer from our largest healthcare system join us. I didn't vet him or the lawyer who joined us in terms of where they stood on the issue, though I had a sense that they were reasonable people in this, and in the way that's being used here. And you know, they had complex, nuanced positions on vaccine mandates, but in the end, certainly thought vaccines themselves were a good thing. Science has been established and all that. And so I didn't ask anybody to come on who represented the anti-vaccine position. And that's, again, falls into one of those areas where I don't know, in terms of the question that was applied there, I don't know if that's the dominant position here in Michigan. I wouldn't say that, but it certainly has a strong following and backing. And it's just one of those areas where I based on my knowledge of the science, the panelists that we had on, the message we were trying to convey, how we wanted to inform the public, I didn't want to engage in a raucous debate that would have been a sideshow to that, or would have allowed somebody a platform to spread more disinformation. So I think I could be rightly criticized for maybe not bringing somebody on who could have spoken more negatively about vaccines, but we've just I've made a decision not to do that.
I just want to comment, Michael, that I think you mentioned this in your talk, and I think it really is a rich issue and a difficult issue around when you bring in legitimately opposing points of view on an issue versus when you decide, nope, legitimate opposition on this issue is no longer legitimate. And sometimes that's very clear, like the slavery example you brought up, like,
Right.
Yes, definitely, right?
Right.
But other times it's not so clear.
Of
And
course.
I think we have to make, I mean, yeah, it's a really tricky issue. And I think it bears on, free speech conflicts more broadly at our universities too. Like when we think about a speaker, maybe being controversial, but having legitimate point of view that's going to be enriching our conversations that way versus controversial and actually not contributing enough. And that strikes me as I'm not always comfortable with my decisions around that because, I think it's just too convenient, that all the people we bring in have to be people I think are really intelligent. I mean, it's a little bit too convenient in some cases. So,
well, here's how nervous I am about my own argument, and that in the fall, I'm bringing in a former student who's a constitutional law scholar now, fairly well recognized, who disagrees with me on this disinformation, question. And so we're going to bring in a panel of constitutional law scholars to talk about academic freedom, its ties to freedom of speech and the First Amendment. And he thinks I'm wrong about anything censorious, even just disinformation, misinformation. He doesn't care. There should be platforms for all of it. So I want to keep engaging in that argument for my own sake. And he's one of the best people I can think of to do that. But I take your point.
We're almost out of time, but I do want to give Sandy a moment to note that this problem of which voices count has been dominant in journalism ethics for forever. Sandy is one of the leading experts in journalism ethics in the country. You know, you got to interview both sides of the debate. You want to throw in 30 seconds worth on that, Sandy?
30 seconds. Well, obviously, this is debated a lot in journalism. It's interesting to me in the sense, there's a sense in which we've become more media literate, for which I'm grateful. I think, you know, the public is kind of onto this two sides-ism problem, right? That long typified objective journalistic coverage. I'm always intrigued, though, when I get into these discussions with journalists, how committed they really are to objectivity still as a guiding norm for the profession, despite the kinds of problems it has created and the kinds of criticisms it's come in for. But I think the profession is definitely working through this, right, in terms of trying to figure out when is it appropriate, right, to treat this as an issue that has only two sides, right, to go back to Michael's point, and furthermore, you know, how to treat the two sides, right, whether they're of equal weight or not. I think journalists have become better at this, but I would argue there's still a lot to do here. My 30 seconds. Ongoing issue, I think.
Thanks. I want to thank all the panelists. As you can tell, I went into this project very reluctantly. Previous editorial enterprises were painful. I ended up having a blast. The papers were great, wonderful exchanges with all the contributors, and I think all of that came through in our discussion today. Keep your eyes out for the issue. It should be arriving in your inboxes. I assume it will be somehow forwarded with a link to all APPE as well as all SEAC members. And then I don't know how they're handling the paper distribution. You might have to request that. And then again, depending on the interest of it, we may turn it into an edited book collection down the road. So keep your eyes open for a call for papers, or just don't hesitate to drop me a note and tell me you're interested in contributing to that, which I will forward along to whoever's going to be the future editor of this project. With that, I thank all the panel members again, Tyler, for hosting this on your Zoom page, and I wish everybody a safe, happy springtime.
Thanks, Christopher. Thanks, everybody.